Somewhere in what we now call Iraq, approximately 2,500 years ago, the most formidable city on earth stood proudly on the banks of a river. Its walls were so immense that 2 chariots could race side by side along their summit, and its towering structures were visible for many kilometers. Gold adorned its temples, and its millions of inhabitants were subtly convinced that no army on earth could ever breach their defenses. They were wrong. In a single quiet and almost absurdly anticlimactic night, the empire that had dominated the known world for over a century simply ceased to exist. There was no apocalyptic battle, no heroic last stand. The city fell while most of its people were celebrating. The man responsible was a Persian king named Cyrus, and the tale of how he achieved this, and what he did next, is one of the most extraordinary in human history. The historical record of this era largely survives in fragments, crumbling clay tablets, ancient Greek histories written generations later, the accounts of Hebrew prophets, and one remarkable clay cylinder, unearthed from Babylon's ruins in 1879, now housed in the British Museum. For centuries, this evidence lay silent static in collections and archives. But using advanced AI techniques, we can now take those ancient engravings, faded illustrations, and architectural reconstructions, transforming them into something previously unseen. A world that vanished 25 centuries ago, restored to full life. What you are witnessing now is that very city rebuilt, a world resurrected. The fall of Babylon is more than just a history lesson. It's a profound narrative about power, arrogance, faith, strategy, and what happens when a civilization forgets the very foundations of its greatness. To grasp why the fall of Babylon sent shockwaves through the ancient world, you must first understand its true nature. By the 6th century BCE, it was the largest city on Earth. Estimates place its population between 200, and perhaps 500,000 people, numbers not seen again in the Western world for centuries. The city was situated in the heart of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, on the banks of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates didn't merely flow near the city, it ran directly through it, splitting Babylon in two. Its outer walls stretched roughly 18 kilometers in circumference, and in some sections, they were so wide that houses were built atop them. These were not stone walls, but rather constructed from fired brick and bitumen, materials so dense and heavy that ancient writers considered them essentially impenetrable. Within these formidable walls, the city was extraordinary. The Great Processional Way, a wide ceremonial road, ran north to south, flanked by walls of glazed blue brick adorned with 120 lions crafted from gold and white tile. At the northern entrance stood the Ishtar Gate, one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world. This towering archway of deep lapis blue brick was covered in golden dragons and bulls dedicated to the gods. In the city center rose the Achaemenid, a massive ziggurat, a step temple tower 7 stories tall. It was so immense that later Jewish writers would refer to it as the Tower of Babel. Scholars believe it may have reached approximately 90 meters in height, roughly equivalent to a modern 25-story building. And then there were the Hanging Gardens. Whether they truly existed as described remains debated. Ancient sources place them in Babylon, though some modern scholars now suggest they might have been in Nineveh. Nevertheless, the very concept of them, terraced gardens rising above the rooftops, irrigated by an extraordinary hydraulic system, speaks volumes about the ambition of this city. This was a place built by people who genuinely believed they lived at the center of the universe, and for a long time, they were not entirely wrong. The individual most responsible for Babylon's glory was Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 BCE to 562 BCE. He was not a gentle ruler. He was a relentless, methodical conqueror, willing to destroy anything that stood between him and domination. His campaigns reshaped the map, pushing Babylon's borders south to the Persian Gulf, north into Anatolia, and west all the way to Egypt. When Egypt resisted, he marched his armies there as well. But it was one particular campaign that would resonate through 3,000 years of history. In 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, bringing the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline under Babylonian control, including a small landlocked kingdom called Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. The people of Jerusalem resisted, rebelling twice. Both times, Nebuchadnezzar returned. In 587 BCE, his patience ran entirely. His armies laid siege to Jerusalem, and the city held out for over a year. When it finally fell, Nebuchadnezzar razed it to the ground. Temple of Solomon, the holiest site in the Hebrew world, built centuries earlier to house the Ark of the Covenant, was destroyed. Its sacred treasures were taken to Babylon, and the people, the elite of Jerusalem, the priests, craftsmen, and scholars, were marched across the desert to Babylon as captives. This event, known as the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile, would become one of the most formative in the entire history of Judaism. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years. When he died in 562 BCE, Babylon was at its absolute zenith. The empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. What he left behind, however, was an empire without a clear successor and a line of kings who proved completely unequal to the challenge. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, Babylon experienced rapid and tumultuous succession crisis. Within 7 years, 3 different kings ascended the throne. 2 were murdered by their own courts. In 556 BCE, a man named Nabonidus seized power. He was not of royal blood. His mother was a priestess of the moon god Sin at the temple in Haran. By all ancient accounts, he was deeply religious, highly educated, passionate about archaeology and ancient history, and politically disastrous. Almost immediately, Nabonidus began to implement policies that baffled his court. He elevated the cult of Sin, the moon god, above Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. This might sound like an internal religious dispute, but in the ancient world, the relationship between the king and the priesthood was a matter of political power. Marduk's priests managed the temples, the granaries, and the land. They were among the most powerful men in the empire. By sidelining Marduk, Nabonidus was picking a fight he could not win. Then he did something even stranger. Approximately in 552 BCE, after about 3 years on the throne, Nabonidus left Babylon. He traveled deep into the Arabian desert to a distant oasis called Tema, in what is now northwest Saudi Arabia, and remained there for nearly a decade. Why? Historians still debate this. Some believe he was driven out by conflict with the Marduk priesthood. Others think he genuinely believed he had a religious mission. Some speculate he was unwell. The ancient verse account of Nabonidus, a Babylonian document, simply states he abandoned the city and neglected his duties. Whatever the reason, the practical consequences were catastrophic. The annual New Year festival in Babylon, the Akitu, required the king to take the hand of the statue of Marduk in the Great Temple. If the king was absent, the festival could not be held. For 10 years, it wasn't. And without the Akitu, the king's authority was technically unconfirmed in the eyes of both the gods and the people. Back in Babylon, his son Belshazzar ruled as regent. Belshazzar was a capable soldier, but he was not the king. He could not perform the sacred rites. He could not restore confidence. Trade was disrupted, the priesthood was alienated, and the provinces grew restless. When Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon around 543 BCE, he found an empire quietly unraveling. To the east, a new power had been steadily growing for years, meticulously observing Babylon's slow disintegration. Cyrus II was born around 600 BCE in the small Persian kingdom of Anshan, located in the southwestern highlands of what is now Iran. His father, Cambyses I, was king of Anshan, a vassal state under the shadow of the Median Empire to the north. The Medes were the dominant power in the region at this point. The Persians were their subjects. A story of Cyrus's birth, as told by the Greek historian Herodotus, reads more like myth than history. His grandfather Astyages, king of the Medes, had a dream that his grandson would one day overthrow him. Astyages ordered the baby killed, but the soldier tasked with the job could not bring himself to do it, and instead gave the infant to a shepherd to raise. The child grew up in the hills, extraordinary even among shepherds, until he was discovered and brought back to court. How much of this is legend is impossible to say. What we know for certain from contemporary sources is that Cyrus was indeed the son of Cambyses. He ruled Anshan from around 559 BCE, inheriting a kingdom technically subordinate to the Medes. He did not remain subordinate for long. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus launched a revolt against Astyages. The details are murky, but ancient accounts agree on the outcome. Astyages' own army mutinied, handed their king over to Cyrus, and the Median Empire collapsed. Cyrus captured the Median capital of Ecbatana, modern Hamadan in Iran, and absorbed an empire that had dominated the region for generations. What he did next defined everything that followed. He did not loot Ecbatana, he did not massacre the Medes. He absorbed them, their warriors into his army, their administrators into his government, their nobility into his court. He was building something entirely different from anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. By the time Cyrus finished absorbing Media, he controlled a vast stretch of the Iranian plateau. However, he had also inherited Media's enemies and its ambitious neighbors. The wealthiest of these was Croesus, king of Lydia, whose kingdom occupied what is now western Turkey. Croesus was so immensely rich that to this day, we still use the expression as rich as Croesus. He controlled enormous gold deposits along the Pactolus River and is credited with minting some of the world's earliest coins. Croesus had been allied with Astyages and viewed Cyrus's rise as a direct threat. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, the famous Greek oracle, who told him that if he crossed the Halys River into Persian territory, he would destroy a great empire. What the oracle failed to specify was which empire. Croesus crossed the river. The two armies fought to a stalemate at Pteria. Croesus retreated home for the winter, planning to resume hostilities in the spring. Cyrus, however, did not wait. He pursued Croesus immediately, catching the Lydian army near Thymbra. Facing Croesus' famous cavalry, Cyrus deployed an unusual tactic. He placed his camels at the front. Horses instinctively fear and avoid camels, and the Lydian cavalry panicked and broke. Croesus retreated to his capital city of Sardis, which fell after a 14-day siege. Again Cyrus spared the defeated king. Croesus was taken prisoner but treated generously, reportedly kept at court as an advisor. The pattern was becoming clear. Where other kings destroyed, Cyrus absorbed. With Lydia taken, the Greek cities of Anatolia quickly fell into line. By around 540 BCE, Cyrus controlled an empire stretching from modern Afghanistan in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. There was now only one power left that could rival him, and he had been watching its slow disintegration with great interest. In 539 BCE, Cyrus turned his attention south and west to Babylon. He knew the city well, having received intelligence from inside it for years. Priests dissatisfied with Nabonidus, merchants whose trade had been disrupted, and officials who had decided that Persian rule might, on balance, be preferable to the chaos of the current regime all contributed. Two men in particular were crucial. Gobryas, a Babylonian governor from the region of Gutium near the Zagros Mountains, and a man named Gadatas. Both harbored grievances against Nabonidus or Belshazzar, and both defected to Cyrus. They brought detailed knowledge of Babylon's defenses, its supply routes, and its troop dispositions. Cyrus gathered his army. An ancient Babylonian text, clearly written from a Babylonian perspective, describes his forces arriving like the water of a river whose number was immeasurable. Modern historians consider this hyperbole, but the Persian army at this point was genuinely formidable. Battle-hardened veterans of campaigns across 3 decades, diverse in origin yet unified in discipline. The campaign unfolded in stages. First, Cyrus secured the territory east and north of Babylon. Then, in September 539 BCE, the decisive military confrontation occurred near the city of Opis on the Tigris River. A Babylonian army met the Persians, resulting in a crushing Persian victory. The Babylonian chronicles, contemporary clay tablets, recording events year by year, describe what followed. The city of Sippar, north of Babylon, opened its gates to the Persians without a fight. Just days later, Nabonidus fled. The chain of command collapsed. Gobryas, leading a Persian advance force, now moved on Babylon itself. He reached the city, and here the ancient sources diverge in ways that historians still debate today. The Babylonian chronicles state that Babylon was taken without battle. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about a century later, describes an elaborate stratagem. Cyrus diverted the Euphrates River, lowering the water level enough for his troops to march along the riverbed and slip under the massive bronze river gates, entering the city through its water channels. Both accounts may contain truth. Gobryas, with inside help and detailed knowledge of the city's layout, likely led a night infiltration using the river route described by Herodotus, while the main army positioned itself outside the walls. Either way, by the 12th or 13th of October, 539 BCE, Persian soldiers were inside Babylon. Now we come to the most extraordinary detail in this entire story. On the night the Persians entered Babylon, the city was in the midst of a festival. Herodotus records it clearly. The inhabitants of Babylon's outer quarters, a city so vast that it took hours to walk from one end to the other, did not even know the city had fallen until long after Persian troops had secured the center. They were dancing, they were drinking, and they heard nothing unusual. In the palace, Belshazzar was holding a feast. The Book of Daniel, a Hebrew text written centuries later, but drawing on earlier sources, gives this feast a dramatic and specific character. Belshazzar, flushed with confidence, ordered the sacred golden vessels, looted from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, to be brought out and used as drinking cups. He and his court drank from them while toasting the gods of Babylon. Then, according to Daniel, a disembodied hand appeared and wrote 4 words on the plastered wall of the banquet hall. Many, tekel, upharsin. The court was paralyzed with terror. No one could interpret the words until Daniel, a Jewish exile kept at the Babylonian court, was brought in. He translated, "God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." That same night, Belshazzar was killed. How exactly? The sources disagree, but by dawn he was dead. Historians treat the writing on the wall as theological allegory, not literal history. But the core of the account, the feast, the overconfidence, the sudden and catastrophic fall, is entirely consistent with other sources. Babylon's leadership spent the night of its own destruction in celebration. That detail, regardless of its precise interpretation, carries a weight that has echoed through 2,500 years of literature. By morning, Gobryas and his forces controlled the city. The gates were secured, and the temples were placed under guard. The Babylonian chronicles note with a kind of dazed bureaucratic calm that Gushan guards were placed at the gates of the great temple of Bel. There was no interruption of any kind to the rites of Esagila or the other temples. The last indigenous empire of ancient Mesopotamia, the civilization that traced an unbroken line back 4,000 years to the very origins of writing, the city-state, and the wheel was over, and the guards at the temple did not even skip their morning prayer. Cyrus himself did not enter Babylon on the night it fell. He waited. On the 29th of October 539 BCE, 17 days after the city was taken, Cyrus made his formal entry into Babylon. He entered not as a conqueror in the traditional sense, but as a liberator. The Cyrus Cylinder describes this moment in detail. "My numerous troops moved about undisturbed in the midst of Babylon. I did not allow anyone to terrorize the land. I kept in view the needs of Babylon and all its sanctuaries to promote their well-being." He paid homage to Marduk, attended the temple rites, and presented himself not as a foreign occupier, but as the legitimate king of Babylon, the one the gods themselves chose because the previous king had abandoned his duties. The Babylonians' priests, who had suffered under Nabonidus for over a decade, were receptive. The Marduk priesthood essentially endorsed Cyrus publicly. The transition of power happened with a degree of cooperation that would have been unthinkable under any previous conqueror. Nabonidus was captured and deported, his life spared, another almost bewildering act of restraint by ancient standards. There was no mass execution of the defeated court, no enslavement of the population, no burning of the palaces. Babylon became the winter capital of the Persian Empire. Gobryas was made its defender, and Cyrus, now king of Babylon as well as king of Persia, Media, Lydia, and a dozen other nations, stood at the head of the first true world empire in history. Shortly after taking Babylon, Cyrus issued a decree. It was written in Akkadian cuneiform on a clay cylinder approximately 23 centimeters long. This object, the Cyrus Cylinder, is now in the British Museum. The text is in part propaganda. Every ancient royal inscription is, painting Nabonidus as impious and oppressive, and Cyrus as the chosen of Marduk. Scholars are cautious about taking it at face value, but the policy it describes was real and revolutionary. Cyrus ordered the return of all exiled peoples to their homelands. He ordered the restoration of the gods and sacred objects that previous kings had looted and placed in Babylon. He declared that the peoples of his empire should be free to worship as they chose. Among those exiles was the Jewish community. The Hebrew Bible records the moment in extraordinary detail. Cyrus issued a specific edict, preserved in the books of Ezra and 2 Chronicles, authorizing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the Temple of Solomon, which Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed 48 years earlier. He returned the sacred gold and silver vessels that had been taken from the temple and reportedly provided funding from the royal treasury. Around 50,000 Jews made the journey home. The historical debate about the Cyrus Cylinder is important to acknowledge here. Some historians argue it does not describe a general policy of religious freedom, but rather a specific set of political decisions designed to win the loyalty of Babylon's powerful temple institutions. They point out that the cylinder says nothing about Jews specifically, and that the first human rights charter label, famously promoted by the Shah of Iran in 1971, is a modern projection onto an ancient document. Both things can be true. The cylinder is a piece of political calculation, and it still represents something genuinely different from anything that came before it. In a world where conquest normally meant enslavement and cultural erasure, Cyrus built an empire on the principle that keeping people intact and content was more efficient than destroying them. Whether that was idealism or pragmatism, the result was the same. In the years after Babylon, Cyrus continued expanding the empire eastward. He pushed Persian power into Central Asia, into what is now Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. His empire eventually stretched from the Aegean Sea in the west to the edge of the Indian subcontinent in the east, the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. He died in battle around 530 BCE, fighting a nomadic people called the Massagetae on the empire's northeastern frontier. He was roughly 70 years old. The exact circumstances of his death are disputed, but ancient sources agree he died on campaign, leading from the front. He is buried at Pasargadae, his first capital in Persia, in a simple stone tomb that still stands today. No pyramid, no massive temple complex, a modest tomb, 6 steps up to a small chamber. The inscription, according to ancient sources, read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus who gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body." Whether Cyrus actually ordered those words, or they were added by later admirers, they capture something real about how he was remembered. Alexander the Great, who destroyed the Achaemenid Empire 2 centuries later, visited Cyrus's tomb and reportedly ordered it restored and protected. He considered Cyrus the model of what a conqueror should be. The Romans studied Cyrus. The writers of the American Constitution knew his story. The United Nations has a replica of the Cyrus cylinder in its lobby. A man born in a minor kingdom on the edge of nowhere, in a world dominated by empires thousands of years old, not only dismantled all of them, but replaced them with something that, by the standards of his time, bordered on the humane. He didn't just end the Babylonian Empire, he ended the entire ancient Near Eastern world order. And in its place, he built something that would shape governance, religious tolerance, and the very idea of empire for the next 2,000 years. Not bad for a king from Anshan. In October 539 BCE, the lights went out on the oldest empire in the world, the city of Babylon. 0 years of continuous civilization, the birthplace of writing, of astronomy, of law, passed from its last native dynasty, without so much as a battle at its gates. What replaced it lasted over 200 years and stretched across 3 continents. And it all began with one man in one small kingdom, who looked at the most powerful empires in the world and decided he could do better. Historians have argued for decades, was Cyrus genuinely a humanitarian, a man ahead of his time who believed in tolerance and human dignity? Or was every single act of mercy, every freed exile, every respected temple, nothing more than cold political calculation designed to make conquest cheaper and rebellion less likely? Even if it was purely strategic, does that make it less remarkable? Or does intent truly matter?